In this video, we are going to take a deeper look at the structure of an interactive object. For that, we are going to go inside the Unity project. So here, I have an apple that I turn into an interactive object. You can make sure that it's an interactive object by checking in the hierarchy of your Unity project that there is this IO written after apple. And if I open it, and take a look at the hierarchy on the left, you can see that there is quite a lot of things going on. We can read interactions, visuals, proximity, and other words like that, up to audio source. We are going to see together what is the meaning of all of these elements. So let's start with interaction. If I open interaction, I can see inside that there is an element called empty. This is kind of a template to create an interaction, to add an interaction to that object, to that interactive object. So what we recommend is that you duplicate this empty interaction and then you rename it and you will use it to create your first interaction. So I'm going to press that empty element. I'm going to click on my keyboard Control and D to duplicate, or on the Mac it would be Command D. And here we go. I have this empty one interaction. So I'm going to name it. So in that case, let's call it eating apple. You can choose the name you want for that interaction, but try to give it a name that makes sense for what the interaction is going to be, So in that case, I call it eating apple because I will use it at some point to create an interaction where we are going to be able to eat that apple. So I'm just going to name it eating apple. We are going to see in detail everything inside that interaction and what we can do later on. But for now, I'm just going to give you the quick overview of all the elements inside our interactive object. So then we have the visual. If I check the visual inside, I can see that apple. That's the apple we had previously, We turned the apple into an interactive object. That's kind of the original apple that we turned into an IO that you can see here. So this is very useful later on if you want to, for example, let's say you want to hide the visual of an object. You could use this visual of the apple, for example, to hide your apple interactive object, but without deactivating it. The visual could even be empty. Your interactive object would still work, just it would not have a visual representation in your scene. That's something you might want to do, for example, if you want to create an invisible trigger. Let's say you would like to have an empty square on the ground that if the user walk on it, something happen. So it's an invisible trigger. To do that, you would have an empty visual element in this interactive object. But you would still have to keep that main visual element even if there is nothing inside. So don't delete the visual element, but delete what would be here if you don't want any visual for your interactive object. Then we have several colliders attached to that interactive object. So we have proximity, gaze, handover, manipulate, snap, left and right. And then we have an audio source. So let's start with proximity. This is an area, so you can see in the scene, this is this kind of green 3D box. This is the collider proximity. You can see it in the right in the inspector. There is a box collider. And so this green cube is the box collider of the proximity element. So this area around the interactive object will be used to detect the proximity with another object. We have a condition called proximity that we will see later. And it's using this collider, this cube around our object to detect the proximity between different objects. So just keep in mind that this is something you will use later and you can also tweak it. On the right, you will see that you can change its size and change the shape or the size. We will see that later. But just so you know, this proximity collider is something used in the condition called proximity. You just need to make sure that each trigger on the right in the inspector is checked, otherwise it won't work. The gaze element, now it's also a collider, so you might think that we didn't change, but it's actually another collider. It's still this kind of green cube around our object. And this one is used for, as you might guess, the gaze condition, which is another condition that we can use to create interactions. This is a collider that will detect kind of if we are looking at the object. So in the Zoe, in Unity, the user view that we can see, in VR, it's a camera. That camera has axis, so on the X, Y, and Z axis. And so we use one of the axes of the camera, basically looking forward. So when you are seeing in VR in your Unity project, when you look straight, this is kind of a direction. And so we are using that direction to see if we are looking at the object. So just so you know, we use this collider for the gaze condition that we'll see in detail later on. And so similar to the proximity one, you just need to make sure that each trigger is checked and you can play around with the size. Also, it's important to know that in Unity, you have several colliders. We use the box collider in here because it's simple, but you have a circle collider, capsule collider, sphere collider, even custom colliders. So any of these colliders could work as long as each trigger is checked, basically. But for simplicity, we stick to this box collider for the moment. Then we have the handover, which is also a collider, a cube collider. As you can see, it's still the same cube. It's another one, but it looks the same for the moment, of course. It's used for the point and click condition, which is another condition that we can use to create interactions with Zoe. We will see that later as well. It will detect if there is basically in VR, we have controllers, that we hold with our hands. And so these controllers are inside Unity, and there is a laser pointing from the origin of this laser is your controller in VR, and it's pointing somewhere, and it has a specific length as well. And basically, this collider will detect if our laser is touching it or not, basically. So it's another collider that is a trigger. So you need once again to make sure its trigger is checked that we can use to create interaction. Then we have the manipulate one, which is once again another box collider. And this time it's used for the manipulate condition. Ideally, it should match more or less the shape of the object it represents because for this condition, it's how we are going to be able to grab the object. So of course, you want the collider to kind of mimic a bit the shape of the object because it feels more natural. One tip I can give you is that always try to make the collider a bit bigger than the object in that case, so that it will be easier for your users to grab the object. Because maybe if the collider is too small, it might be a bit hard to know if we grab the object or not. So if you are not sure, always make it just a bit bigger than the size of the object. Finally, we have the snap left and snap right. As you can see now, it changed. It's no more a collider. It's just kind of a point. It's kind of a point that still has its coordinate, on the X, Y, Z axis. But it's just a point. It's not a box. And so we can change this position. And it's something we use because in Zoe, we can have... because in Zoe, when we grab an object, usually it will kind of stick to our controller based on that snap position. So if I want to grab that apple with my left controller, this snap left element that you can see would be where we kind of touch between the controller and the apple. So this is something good to know. Maybe another example would be that if you put a sword in your VR app, let's say, you would probably want this snap position to be on the handler of the sword rather than the blade, so that when you grab it from the handler of the sword. And finally, there is also an audio source element. This is an element from Unity that we use in Zoe to add audio basically to our interactive object. So this is something that we'll use later if you want to add a sound. I hope you understood everything. That was a lot to see. In the next video, we are going to see how to set up an interactive object. Thanks for watching and see you in the next tutorial.